Hello and welcome to Tavern Talk, episode 3, that is, the podcast where I talk about stuff. So, to recap the last episode of the podcast, I made kind of like a proclamation. Basically, I started accepting user-submitted topics, that is, from you guys, the listeners. Which seems like a pretty good idea to me because perhaps if I came up with my own ideas, I would talk about stuff that you don't really care about or are interested in hearing. So in this way, I can talk about stuff you guys actually want to hear. So in the end, this seemed to have worked out really well. Far better than I ever expected. So now on to the actual topic. I'm going to list the comments, well, not the actual comments specifically, but I'm going to list the user names of the people that submitted comments and what the general gist of their comment is. To, give credit where credit is due, because this particular topic wasn't my idea, it was the idea of these commenters on my YouTube channel. So therefore, I'm going to be mentioning them specifically. So perhaps that's another benefit to submitting a topic. Your name will be mentioned. Not that really matters to you, I'm sure, but it's my way of repaying you folk. So I think the first comment I received suggesting this topic was from Hypocrite. Now, if I mispronounce any of your names, I'm sorry. You should already know that I'm really bad at pronouncing stuff, but I'll try my best. So, hypocrite, as in an actual hippo, his comment was that, I'm going to just paraphrase here, he wants me to talk about my general gaming history, what my first game was, why I played it, where it led me, the consoles I grew up with, and things of that nature. And then Charles was another commenter that chimed in. Or is it chimed in? No, it's chimed in. So Charles came in and he mentioned that he agrees with Hypocrite. He wants me to talk about my first game and the first game that got me into gaming. And then lastly, Master V. And these names, I'm getting them from whenever you leave a YouTube comment, it shows a name next to your comment. So that's where I'm getting these names from. If these names are incorrect or you don't want me to use these names, I'm sorry about that. Gotta go with what I see. But Master V says that he also agrees with Hypocrite and everyone else. But in addition to that, he added that he wanted me to discuss why I tend to gravitate more towards retro games instead of modern releases. This is basically the gist of the topic I'll be discussing today. A combination of what Hypocrite mentioned and also Master V. Because that's what Master V mentioned. He says I can combine all of this stuff since all of this stuff is kind of related. And I suppose it will just lead into each other. So I'm going to begin, I suppose, by going all the way back to the beginning. What was my first game? Basically, I'm going to break down Hypocrite's comment into multiple questions and I suppose try to answer each question individually. And then I'll segue into Master V's idea as kind of like the final thing. So let's get started, shall we? So the very first game I played, considering the kind of reviews I've been writing on my website, I don't know if anyone really bothers to read that kind of stuff, but if you do, you might notice that I review a lot of games mostly from released from the 80s and the 90s. So it may come as a surprise to you that the very first game I don't know if this is the very first game I ever played, but this is definitely, or I think almost definitely, the first game I owned a physical copy of. Well, I mean, back then you pretty much only owned physical copy of games unless you were into PC games. But I didn't play any PC games back in the 80s or the 90s, unfortunately. The very first game I owned was Super Mario World. That is Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, because it's a system that provides entertainment and it's quite super. So why did I say that that's going to be a surprise to you? I mean, maybe it isn't a surprise to you, but the reason why I said it would come as a surprise because that implies that I never really played any NES games as a kid, and I didn't grow up with an NES, and that's true for the most part. So how could I really be into games released on the NES or reviewing games on the NES if I didn't really grow up with it? I suppose you could say that's kind of unusual or whatever. The closest thing I had to an NES growing up was an original brick Game Boy, which I suppose you can consider that to be an 8-bit system. But the Game Boy was fairly popular around the time the Super Nintendo was out, although it came out in 1989 before the Super Nintendo was released. And I was a pretty big fan of the Game Boy. I had one and I played lots of old Game Boy games on it. So that's kind of like the closest I got to exposing myself to NES games back then. Since a lot of early Game Boy games were kind of like hand-me-down ports of NES games. Like I had Mega Man 1 and 2 on there, they were not really ports, but they were kind of like, I don't know, like demakes or whatever of the NES versions of those games. And also had a bunch of other Game Boy games. But I got the Super Nintendo and Super Mario World. I mean, Super Mario World came packaged with my Super Nintendo. That's something that they did early on in the console's lifespan, but I think later on they started to package the console with other games. Like I found out they started to package the console with Donkey Kong Country, and then later with Yoshi's Island. And those are certainly great games, but personally my opinion is that Super Mario World is the best introduction to the system. So I think that's the best game to start off with. And that's the game that I started out with. And I definitely liked it. So that's the first game. I'm pretty sure that's the first game I actually owned and played a lot of. It's possible that I might have owned a Sega Genesis first. And if that's the case, then maybe Sonic 2 is my first game, because that was the first game I got on the Genesis. But I'm almost sure I got the Super Nintendo before the Genesis. I mean, since all of this is a long time ago now, over 20 years ago, it's my memory is not 100% on this stuff anymore. Sadly, my memory is not completely, accurate. So I'm going to try my best to remember as best as I can about all of this stuff. Now, what is the actual first game I played? I used to think that the first game I played was Super Mario World, but then I found out that's probably not true. It's possible I might have played a game on the NES before that, but I don't really have a very good recollection of that. If I did in fact play NES games before, I don't remember too vividly. However, I do kind of have evidence that it's possible I might have played an NES. Like, I used to think that I never came into contact with an NES at all throughout my childhood, but it turns out that's actually not true. Because recently like a couple of years back, I was watching a bunch of old home videos on like VHS tapes. And the reason why I was watching them is because I was converting them to digital files on the computer using a capture device. And in one of the videos, I was, was a kind of a small kid, and I was at a friend's house, and he had an NES, and he was playing the NES, and perhaps I might have played the NES with him. It wasn't too clear if I actually played the NES with him, but I was there, and I was kind of watching him play the NES. I saw my friend playing Pinball, DuckTales, and also Bomberman. I think it was the first NES Bomberman. But anyhow, those were NES games that I was exposed to as a child. Now, there was another thing which unfortunately I don't have footage of this, so I don't know how true or accurate this is, but there was another instance where I was over my older cousin's house, and I think I might have played the NES there, or maybe it was an Atari 2600. I don't really remember. But I played some kind of 8-bit system, and I played a couple of 8-bit games on there. I remember only playing 2 games on there. It's probably an NES. I mean, that's far likelier. It probably wasn't an Atari 2600 because the reason why I thought it might have been a 2600 was because I remember seeing wood grain, and I think the 2600 had wood grain on it. But realistically, it was probably an NES because I don't remember. The 2600 has a joystick controller, and I remember not using a joystick controller. I remember using a traditional D-pad controller, or I suppose a joystick controller was at the time also still pretty traditional. Anyhow, I played some mystery 8-bit system at my older cousin's house, and I played 2 games on there. I might have played more games, but I don't remember what they are, or what they were, rather. One of them was Pac-Man, the 8-bit NES Pac-Man. And the other one was, I actually don't know what the other one was. To this day, I still don't really know what it was. But I seem to remember it was some kind of game where it was kind of like an overhead game, and there were a bunch of seagulls, and there was water, and you have to like walk from one seagull to another and try not to fall into the water. And it was basically you have to live as long as possible. Kind of reminds me now of Frogger, but you weren't a frog. You were like little dude, kind of looked like Mario, and he had like blue clothing or a blue hat or something. I've never been able to figure out what that game was or what it's called. I tried looking it up several times, but I never saw anything that looked anything remotely like that. And now I'm sort of like I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but now I'm kind of like an expert on old games from the NES and Super NES and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of know like almost every single major NES game that exists, and even a lot of the obscure ones. And I still haven't encountered anything that looked even remotely like what I remembered. So it's possible this game doesn't actually exist, and maybe I just fabricated it or something, I don't know. But Pac-Man definitely exists, and I think I did play that. Now, because I don't have any footage of this, it's possible that my memory of this is completely inaccurate, and maybe this didn't happen at all. So I have unfortunately no way to really confirm this. And I think this might have been also before I had a Super Nintendo at home. So it's possible these were some of the first games I played. And I actually have a funny story about that. We're going to get a couple of like little stories from my past here, since that's what we're talking about. So like when I was at my cousin's house and playing on this mystery system, which was probably an NES, my mom was there, and to give a reference, I was really young around this time, like maybe under 6 years old. So my mom was there, and she was like, well, you know, your cousins, because they were brothers. I had 2 cousins, and they were brothers, and I was at their house. So she was like, well, your cousins have this weird new revolutionary device. I'm paraphrasing, of course. She didn't actually describe it as that, but it was a weird, strange, newfangled electronic device. Do you want to play on it? I mean, they've given you the permission or allowed you to play with it if you want, so do you want to check it out? And I was pretty bored, so I was just like, yeah, sure. So she helped me insert the cartridges into the system. She turned the system on and she inserted the cartridges. She told me what the cartridges were and that kind of silly kind of stuff. And So basically, this story, I don't want to go into this too much, but this funny story, it's supposed to be a funny story. She always told me options. My options were like Batman and some other kinds of games. So the other kinds of games, she would she'd read their labels or whatever, or maybe the box, like what was written on the box. And for some reason, she always, the only thing that sounded interesting to me as a kid back then when she was reading this stuff was Batman. All the other games sounded honestly like boring, terrible nonsense. And they were, because I tried them and I remember all of them being pretty boring. I don't remember what they were anymore, but I just remember them being like pretty bad. So anyways, my mom would be like, so you want Batman or like this other stuff that sucks? And I'd be like, well, even as a kid, I knew what Batman was, and I was like, well, Batman is pretty cool, so it stands to reason that the game would probably be pretty cool, I guess. So I'll go with Batman. So then she'd be like, okay, here goes, and she'd insert the cartridge and power the system on, and then I'd get Pac-Man. And then I'd be like, well, even as a kid, I knew this wasn't Batman, this is Pac-Man. I know what Pac-Man is. And then I'd play Pac-Man for a few minutes, it'd be alright, but I would get bored of it. And then I'd be like, I really want to play that Batman game you were talking about. Can you insert that? And then she'd be like, okay, Batman, and then I would get Pac-Man again. And that happened several times, and obviously even as a kid I was like, there's something funny going on here. I'm not actually getting Batman, I'm getting Pac-Man. And to this day I still don't really know what the explanation for that is. I don't know really what could have possibly have gone on in my mother's mind. And of course, I can't really ask her about this now because she wouldn't remember. I mean, not only is this so long ago, but this is the kind of thing that she wouldn't really care to remember because it's, she doesn't know anything about video games and doesn't care. So she's 100% not going to remember this. So, I have theories as to why this is. She's not exactly, English isn't her first language, so it's possible she just mispronounced Pac-Man as Batman or misread it or whatever. Or maybe like for some reason the Pac-Man game was inside the Batman box. So maybe she thought it was Batman based on what was on the box, but maybe it wasn't. And then when she actually put in the cartridge, it was Pac-Man. So I don't know. I have no idea, but I remember that, and it's possible maybe this didn't happen, but maybe it did, and if it did, that's pretty funny, I think. So, we can laugh at that. And now that we're done laughing at that, let's move on. So, I never had an NES at all throughout my childhood, and I didn't even know what an NES was. That's kind of why, like, when I was telling you that I was playing a mystery 8-bit system, the reason why I refer to it as that is because I didn't know what an NES was at the time. I mean, I know what it is now, so I know now that I probably was playing an NES back then, but since I didn't know what it was back then, to me it was just like some kind of electronic gaming device. It was some kind of console, and I just didn't know what it was. And I didn't know what an NES was for most of my childhood. I didn't really know about the NES until later on. And therefore I didn't play any NES games back then. The closest I played to an actual NES game was the Super Nintendo had a game released on it. It was kind of like a compilation of games called Super Mario All-Stars. And I owned that game. I got it fairly close to when I first got the system. And that game basically has the first 3 Mario games on it, which were initially released for the NES, but then they were re-released for the Super Nintendo on All-Stars, and they were remade with 16-bit graphics and sound. So I did technically grow up with Mario's 1, 2, and 3, and I played a lot of Mario 2 and 3 in particular. but I did so on the All-Stars version, not on the original NES versions. So I am pretty thankful for Super Mario All-Stars because those games are pretty cool. And if it wasn't for All-Stars, I probably wouldn't have played them. Especially Mario 3, which is like one of my favorite Mario games of all time. And I have a lot of fond memories of playing that game as a kid. So I think it would have sucked if I didn't get Mario All Stars because then I would have never played Mario 3 as a kid, or the less popular Mario 2. So yeah, I never had an NES, and that's kind of like, I guess, my big dark secret is that I never had an NES. So it's kind of like, a lot of people might be like, well, how can you be a retro gamer or old school gamer if you never had an NES? I mean, you should have had that. That's the 101 of old school gaming. But I didn't have an NES, and what can you do? I mean, I'm certainly old enough that I could have owned an NES and I could have grown up with it. I actually know people younger than me that did in fact grow up with an NES system. So I certainly could have had the NES as part of my history, but I just didn't. It just didn't work out that way because I didn't actually get into video gaming in general until the mid '90s, and by the time it was the mid '90s, the NES wasn't that popular anymore, and the Super Nintendo was kind of the default. So when my parents went out to buy me a system, they got me, whatever was popular at the time, which was the Super Nintendo. One of the first times I played a Super Nintendo was in '92, and I know that because the VHS tapes, or they used to timestamp the videos. So I have a timestamp video of myself playing a Super NES as a kid at my cousin's house, my older cousin's house. And that was actually the first time I ever played the Super NES. And I remember vividly it was the first time. I remember having a lot of trouble with it. I had a lot of trouble walking and jumping at the same time. I know this might sound stupid now, especially everybody listening to this probably is an expert video gamer. But I was a kid, and it was one of the very first times I played a side-scrolling platformer, or a Mario game in general. And I could walk, and I could jump, but for some reason, whenever it came to doing those two activities at the same time, I just couldn't do it for some reason. And sometimes I would start to walk and jump at the same time, but then all of a sudden I would forget the jump button exists, and then I would just stop jumping completely. And then other times I would start pressing the jump button, but then I would forget the D-pad exists, and I would just stop moving, stop walking. So I just had issues with it. And my older cousin, he was pretty understanding about it. I mean, he's like 10 years older than I am, or maybe a little bit less than that. But he was still pretty understanding despite that, and he was trying to teach me how to play the game, showing me what all the buttons do, this button jumps or whatever. And I just wasn't getting it. I kept failing over and over. So after a while, he realized I wasn't getting it, and then he just said, okay, look, I take this side of the controller and you take that side of the controller. Because I guess he realized I was having issues doing two things at once. Like jumping and walking was basically like multitasking for me. And I just couldn't multitask for some reason. So he was like, I think he took one end of the controller and I took the other. I think he was pressing the button to jump and I was pressing the D-pad to walk. And as you can imagine, this didn't work out very well, and we continued to die over and over. And then eventually he was like, okay, let's play two-player mode. And then, you see, well, my cousin, he was kind of a little rascal. And so he said, let's play two-player mode, and he pretended to go into 2-player mode, but it was still 1-player mode. And then he started playing the game on his own. He gave me a controller, we had 2 controllers, and he was like, we're in 2-player mode now, so you can play with me too. And I was like, okay. So, but that wasn't actually the case. It was just still 1-player mode, and it was his turn all the time. He was the one always playing, and I wasn't doing anything. And I kind of realized pretty quickly what had happened. I realized I wasn't playing the game, even though I had the controller, and I was pressing stuff on it. So I realized he was trying to trick me. And for some reason, in my kid brain, I was like, well, I'm gonna trick him back. And then I pretended to believe that I was in fact playing the game in 2-player mode. And I decided to play along, basically. And I don't know if he caught on to it or not, but I just pretended to be tricked by his trick. And then this in turn made me think I tricked him. So I thought this was like a brilliant idea for some reason. You know, I was a kid, I was under 6 years old, so, you know, it wasn't actually a brilliant idea. It was pretty stupid. But anyways, that was that. The only other details to mention about this story, which you'll only understand if you played Mario World, is that we were playing the special world. At the end of the game in Mario World, you unlock this super hard world called the Special World. And I remember vividly it's a special world. And it was pretty, that was kind of like a bad place for a beginner to start. Because the very first levels I got to play, or the very first levels my cousin made me play, were those really hard special levels. So I don't know why he started me there as opposed to starting me at the beginning of the game. And one last detail I want to mention about this story is that for some reason, every single time Mario died, I would just enter a maniacal, raging fit of laughter. Like I found the concept of Mario dying, or maybe just his death animation, really, really, really hilarious for some reason. I have no idea why. And every single time it happened, I would laugh without fail. Even if I was playing and I died, I would still laugh at it. I wouldn't get upset or anything. I'm thinking it was probably just the death animation, you know, death animation and the sound effect that plays when he dies. For some reason that really made me laugh a lot. Why? I don't know. But anyways, that was my very first time playing Super Mario World. It was all caught on tape, or it was mostly caught on tape. I'm sure there were some parts of it that weren't, but most of it was caught on tape, and that happened in, as I mentioned, in 1992. Now, like a couple of years later, probably like, I don't know, maybe in 93 or 94, is when I finally got my very own Super Nintendo. So, and I remember this pretty vividly. Unfortunately, I don't have this on tape, so this is all from my memory, and we know how inaccurate that can be, so some of this might not be too accurate, but it's all I've got. So, I remember it was, I think, shortly after, or maybe shortly before my birthday, and I guess my parents knew that I was interested in video game consoles, or just video games in general. And they wanted to get me a gift. And I think I told them, I was like, I want one of those video game electronic device things. And I wasn't specific about it. I wasn't like, I want a Super Nintendo, or I want a Super Mario World, or Sega Genesis, or Sonic. I didn't know anything about video games. I played video games a couple of times, and I liked it, and I just wanted that. So I was just like, I want video games, you know, whatever. And then my parents were like, they don't know anything about video games either, so they just bought, I guess, whatever was the big thing at the time. But I remember vividly my dad took me to a store. Now, I don't know what this store was, but he took me to a store, and I remember it was at night. And I remember there was like, I think maybe a Nintendo repair shop nearby. It might have been something else. I'm not really sure what it was. But it had a big sign in front of it with a picture of Mario holding a screwdriver. This picture, you might have seen it in like the old Super Nintendo game manuals. The old Super Nintendo manuals, they would have like a customer service section with a number you can call if you have issues. And it would usually show like a picture of Mario with like a screwdriver and maybe like a little toolbox or something. So this is the picture I'm talking about. I saw like a sign with a store with a sign on top of it that had this picture. Now it's possible maybe this didn't actually exist and I just imagined it, but that's what I remember. And then so nearby this store or whatever this building was, we went into like this warehouse area. It was kind of like the back portion of the store, like kind of like the warehouse portion where they store stuff. And my dad went into there and I was with him. We walked there and he was handed a large box. So then after that we went home, we drove home. And like I said, it was at night. So we got home and he unboxed the system, the Super Nintendo. And I was really, really excited. This is probably one of the most I've ever been excited in my entire life, in my entire childhood, and just life in general. And I remember being like super, super stoked about this. It's probably one of my most precious memories. It's a shame I don't have it on tape. Because out of like everything that I have on tape, this is the one thing I really regret not having on tape. But anyways, so he was going to like hook up the system. I didn't know how to hook up the system, but I wanted to learn how to hook it up. And I was really excited. I was so excited. I wanted to see everything, I wanted to see him hook up the cables, hook up the controllers, and like unpack everything. I wanted to see everything being done. So then it was at night and I guess I had to take a bath or a shower or something. My mom came in and she, it was in my room and I was, my dad was unboxing the system and I was there. And then my mom kind of interrupted this moment and was like, "You gotta take a bath." And I was like, just hold on. I wanna see this first. And she was like, "No, you really gotta take a bath now. It's late. You're gonna have to go to bed soon. And we're gonna do stuff tomorrow. So, you gotta do this now." So then I was like, okay, whatever. I'm gonna do it. And then I told my dad, don't do anything while I'm gone. I want you to just stop and not do anything. And then when I come back, then you can continue connecting the system. Because I wanted to see the whole thing being done. And I wanted to like start the game off from the beginning and everything. So, I went and I took a bath and a few minutes later I came out. And then much to my dismay, not only had my dad already connected the system, but he already started playing the game without me. So as you probably can guess, this actually upsetted me pretty greatly. But I didn't, the upsetness didn't last too long because as soon as I saw the game, I just kind of got enamored by it and I just wanted to play it. So my anger quickly washed away, like my anger and disappointment washed away. And then I just sat down and we played Super Mario World together. And I remember the level he was on when I came back was that water level. It's the very first water level. It's not an underwater. It's not underwater. Like you're above the water on land, but there's water in the level. And there's jumping fish. They jump out of the water. It's the very first like waterly level in the first world in Yoshi's Island. So I remember he was on that level when I got back, which meant I guess he beat some of the other levels first. And thinking back on it now, this was pretty unusual because my dad never really played video games. So it was weird that he was playing it. I'm not sure why he was playing it. I guess maybe he got caught up in the excitement. This was some kind of newfangled thing. And I was excited about it and it was like a big deal. So maybe, I don't know, the excitement captured him and he decided to play like a few minutes of it. That's the first time I ever bought my own game console and my own game. So that's a pretty big momentous occasion for me. And then after that, like I think this happened probably like a few days later or maybe the next day, the immediate day following. So I was playing the game on my own after that. Like my parents generally wouldn't play games with me. And I got to the first castle in the game, which was still in the first world. I think it's like Iggy Koopa's castle or whatever. I don't remember the name of it, but I got to the first castle, and then I wasn't having any issues with the game until I got to the first door. Now this enters the door story. This is my embarrassing door story. Now, since this is the first video game I ever owned and the first game ever played for a large period of time, I didn't know that you had to open the door by standing in front of it and pressing up. Now, by this point in time, this was like common knowledge among people who played video games, because plenty of games on the NES made you press up to open a door, and a lot of games on the Super Nintendo did that, and that was just kind of like a common thing you're supposed to know. Like, you instinctively should know that if you've been playing video games for like any degree of time by that point. But since it was all new to me, I didn't know that basic common sense rule. So I saw a door, and I knew I had to enter the door, but I had no idea how to do it. And I kept trying different things and nothing worked. And I would eventually run out of time and die, and I would have to try again, and then nothing worked. So eventually, like, I got so stumped on this that I went to my mom, who was, I think she was like washing dishes at the time. So I went to my mom and I was like, I need help. I don't know how to get through this door in the game. And I don't know why I asked her, because she doesn't know anything about video games, and it's not like she would have done any better. But, you know, as a kid, I guess my instinct was anytime I have issues with something, I would just go to my parents, and then they'd be the magical solver of all problems. So then, you know, my mom was like, okay, let me finish this and I'll go and I'll help you out. So then she went to my room, and we sat down in front of the TV, and she tried to figure out how to get through the door. And she couldn't figure out how to do it either. And I remember around this point, like, for some reason, I was getting really desperate and I was trying different things. So one of my ideas was like, I thought that maybe if I yelled at my television screen, "Open Sesame," the door would open. I know that sounds really dumb, but that's the kind of thing that went through my kid brain. I think the reason why I came up with this idea is because I watched like a cartoon or like a movie where a character used the keyword to open a door, and the keyword was "Open Sesame." I don't remember what cartoon it was or what movie it was exactly. So I guess that's probably where I got the idea from, and I figured, well, maybe this will work in a game. And I mean, obviously I should have known that, you know, this game isn't voice activated. There's no microphones to speak into. So why would something like that work? But I guess I was really young and I didn't understand technology very well. And I kept shouting at my screen, "Open Sesame," over and over and over. And I thought it really was going to open. But then it didn't. Obviously, because that's dumb. Why would it? So eventually things got so dire that my mom went to my dad and she was like, "I can't figure this thing out. Can you help me figure this out?" And he was like, "Okay, whatever." So then you can picture this scene if you want. It was me, my mom, and my dad, and I was a kid, and this is like the early to mid 90s. We were all sitting in front of my television, and we were trying to figure out how to open the gosh darn door. And after a while, we just couldn't figure it out, and then my parents gave up. They were like, "You know what? We can't figure this out. We're sorry. We tried our best. Just go to sleep, and maybe you'll figure it out the next day." Basically, they were like, just sleep on it. And I think it was this was at night again. So I did. I tried for a little while longer. Then I went to bed, and then the next day I tried again. So on the next day I tried. There was one time I actually got through the door for like a few brief moments, but unfortunately I died. And then I spawned like right before the door, because the checkpoint is placed right before the door. So I respawned right before the door, and I didn't know how I got through the door. I just somehow got through it, and I didn't realize what I did, because I was just running in front of the door and pressing all kinds of buttons randomly. So one of those buttons triggered the door opening, and I didn't know which one it was. And I kind of developed this weird theory that I needed to have the fire flower, and I needed to be shooting fireballs while running in front of the door. And I figured this is how you open the door. And I honestly thought that there was a puzzle I had to solve in order to open the door. But eventually, after all this stupid ideas and all this stupidity, I eventually figured out that you press up in front of the door to open it. Because after a while, with trial and error, I did it and I was able to replicate it over and over. And I was like, wait a minute, you press up to open the door. And I felt like I just stumbled onto like the biggest discovery in the universe. And I got so excited when I discovered this that I actually went to my mom. I think she might have been washing the dishes or sleeping or I don't know what. But I went to her and I was so excited. I was like, I figured out how to open the door. I figured it out. You have to press up. And she was like, okay, whatever. You know, she didn't really, I don't know if she even understood what I was talking about, you know, or if she cared. Because, you know, it's a video game and she doesn't really know or care about that kind of stuff. But you know, she was happy for me, and I was pretty happy about it. And you know, that's basically my utterly shameful door story. And I think part of it also was that the doors in Super Mario World are kind of finicky. You have to be like perfectly still, and you have to be standing exactly in the right spot when you press up in front of the door. So if you're slightly off center or if you're moving while you press up, it won't work. And I think that's probably why I got so confused. Because I probably did press up a couple of times, but when it didn't work the first few times, I figured, well, pressing up doesn't work. And then I just didn't press up anymore. But then eventually I realized, yeah, pressing up does work. You just have to do it very carefully. And that's not really an issue with the game. That's just my fault because I was a dumb little kid. And I'm sure if I read the manual, I would have figured this out. And I think there's even like a little text box inside of that very level that when you hit it, it tells you to press up to open the door. So it was just clearly my own stupidity and inexperience. But you know, that's my story of playing Super Mario World for the first time. Then after that, at some point, I don't know exactly what point, I went to Toys R Us because I used to buy all my games from Toys R Us. My mom would take me there and then she'd be like, okay, you can pick a random game. And then I'd pick a game and, you know, we'd buy it. And that's basically where we got almost all our games back in the 90s. And back then, Toys R Us, the system they used to have was that they had little pamphlets. Like they'd have like an aisle with pictures of the game boxes. And then below the game, the picture of the box, it would be like a bunch of little pieces of paper, not pamphlets. And each piece of paper would represent a copy of the game. So if you wanted to buy a game, you would take one of those little like tickets, I guess, and then you would take it to a tiny booth in the corner of the store and hand it to the person inside that booth. And then the person would get the physical copy of the game and give it to you and you would pay for it. I guess this was their anti-theft measure. And that's how I used to buy most of my games at the time. And I used to fantasize about entering that little booth room because it was kind of like a little room. And I remember I used to take a peek into that room whenever I bought a game because there was like a little glass window or something, and I would look through that window whenever the person behind there was getting the game out for me. And I would see like stacks of Super Nintendo boxes factory sealed, like brand new factory sealed Super Nintendo boxes, just stacks of them. Stacks and stacks. It looked like an unlimited amount of stacks. And I used to just fantasize about entering that room and just looking through all those games. Like not even taking them home with me, just looking through them. You know, I would fantasize about stuff like that. I'd even have dreams about it. I guess I was a pretty weird kid. But anyhow, one day I went to Toys R Us, and they had this was definitely in 1994, and you're gonna know why soon. And that's because they had a demo kiosk for Sonic 3. Now, if you don't know, Sonic 3 got released in 1994, so if they had a demo of it in the store, that's because obviously the game was new, and either the game hadn't come out yet or it had just come out. So there was a demo kiosk of Sonic 3, and I guess this was before I had a Sega Genesis, I'm assuming. So I wanted to play it. It looked pretty cool. So, but the thing was, I was too short to play it because I was still a kid, and I was really short, and I just couldn't reach the controllers. These demo kiosks, they kind of have the controllers fastened close to the unit, so you can't like pull the controllers away from the unit and like lower it down to you. So you have to like be level with the unit more or less to play the controller. So I was just too short to reach the controller. And then my mom, she got like a box or a crate, like a small box or a crate. She placed it in front of the unit, and she placed me on top of the box. And then that was how I was able to reach it. It's pretty funny thinking about it now. So then I started playing Sonic 3, or the demo for Sonic 3. I don't remember if this was like the final version of the game, or if this was like an early version of the game. But it was Hydro City Zone, which is the second level of the game. It's a water level. And I remember sucking at it pretty badly. Like I kept dying, mostly because I kept drowning. Even though I died over and over, I really enjoyed myself, and it was a lot of fun. And this is like the moment in my life where like everything kind of clicked, where all of a sudden I had this really deep realization, kind of like an epiphany. And it's kind of weird thinking that I could have such a deep realization at such a young age, because I was still around like maybe around 5 or 6 years old, give or take. So I had this like realization of kind of like, this is what I want to do from now on. Like, this is it. I really enjoy this. This is the ultimate thing I enjoy. And this is my life now, I mean, not to say that this is the only thing in my life, or my entire life would be nothing but this. But like, this is kind of like, I kind of felt like at this moment, this is my calling. This is like, as a kid, I felt like most of the things I did, like watch cartoons, play with G.I. Joes and Transformer toys and stuff like that, I felt like most of this was just killing time. I was bored, and I wanted to do stuff to kill time. But when I played this Sonic 3 demo, I kind of had this realization of like, this is not about killing time anymore. This is not about pushing away boredom. This is what I legit want to do from now on. Like, this beats toys, this beats cartoons, this beats every other thing I ever did from until that point. And this is what this was a keeper. I knew like, I wasn't just talking about Sonic 3 in particular. I mean, I made this realization about video games in general. Basically, Sonic 3 kind of helped me realize how important games are going to become for me. And, if I didn't know the future, you could say, well, how could you possibly know that? You were only a kid. You cannot make such a deep realization at like 6 years old. But I mean, considering where I'm at now, I guess that ended up being pretty accurate. So anyways, I played Sonic 3, and it was pretty cool. And then I got a Sega Genesis shortly thereafter. And I got, since I got my Sega Genesis in 94, I got the Model 2. I think the Model 2 came out sometime in either 93 or 94. There was a bundle available that combined Sonic 2 and the Genesis Model 2. And that bundle came out in 94. So that's the bundle that I got. And it came with, like I said, it came with Sonic 2. And that was the first Sonic game I owned. I guess the first Sonic game I played probably was Sonic 3, since, like I said, I played the demo. But the first one I actually owned was Sonic 2. And then later on, I bought Sonic 3. And at some point, I bought Sonic 1 as well. Because I went to one of my other cousins' house. Like, these are different cousins, not the same cousins that had a Super Nintendo. And they had a couple of Genesis games with the Genesis. And one of the games they had, I think, was Strider. Unfortunately, I never owned that game as a kid. I just played it briefly. But another game I played over at my cousin's house was Sonic 1. And I really, really liked it for some reason. Even though I guess Sonic 1 is a step back from Sonic 2 and 3. I still enjoyed it a lot. And even though I had played Sonic 2 and 3 before Sonic 1, there was just something about it I really liked. The furthest I got when I first played Sonic 1 was Marble Zone, which is the second level. And I don't know, there was just something about it that I really enjoyed. I really liked the way it looked and the music, and there was just something unique about it compared to the future Sonic games. So then after that, I told my mom, hey, I would like to get Sonic 1. And she was like, okay. So we just went to, I think I went to Walmart and I bought Sonic 1 later. And, but going back to like a little bit before that, when I got Sonic 2 first, and I remember when Sonic and Knuckles came out, that was a big deal for me, and I got that game shortly when it launched. I think it launched like towards the end of '94. Came out like a few months after Sonic 3. But anyways, and I actually have footage of me playing Sonic 3, and I was with my friends. It was my birthday, and my friends from school were over. I was, pretty early on in school at that point, and we were just playing Sonic 3 together. And I was like, by this point, I was kind of like an expert on Sonic 3 already. I had already beaten it a couple of times. So I was playing as Sonic, and my friend was playing as Tails, and I think his sister was there, and she was just watching us play. And like my friend, since he hadn't played the game, he wasn't too good at it. So I was like, as I was playing the game, I was kind of like giving like pro strats, quote unquote. And I was like, for this particular section, you gotta be careful because there's spikes down there, and you should jump this at this particular moment, and like this boss is gonna show up from the left, so be careful and whatever. So I was kind of like being kind of like a big shot, like I'm Mr. Know-it-all. I know how to do all the stuff in the games or whatever. And it was pretty fun. I had a good time, and I guess my friends had a good time. I mean, they got to play Sonic 3. You can't beat that. That's like one of the best games ever, especially at the time. So it was pretty cool. I have a lot of fond memories of what I like to call the golden era of gaming, which is the early to mid 90s and the 16-bit era. So anyways, now I want to kind of go into like 3D gaming. So I started off with 2D gaming, but 3D gaming still happened while I was a kid. So it's not like I was I didn't grow up with it. I technically grew up with both 2D gaming and 3D gaming. But 2D gaming, it happened earlier on in my childhood, and then 3D gaming happened towards like the end of my childhood, or towards the latter half. And of course, I'm talking about the release of the N64 and the PS1 and the Saturn and all that stuff. I was kind of ostracized from the rest of the gaming community because I didn't have internet, and not too many of my friends knew about video games or had video games. Like most of my friends got their gaming info from me, and I got my gaming info from essentially nothing because I had no way of obtaining gaming info aside from the occasional gaming magazine. In the early to mid 90s, I bought gaming magazines very sparingly, like from the stores like Blockbuster and stuff like that. So I kind of was closed off. I didn't know what games were coming out at the time or stuff like that. So I didn't know about the PS1 or the Saturn, even though they came out in '95. I had no idea about them around that point. I had Nintendo Power at that point. Like I remember I had the issue with Yoshi's Island on the cover. I bought it from a store, and I remember getting Yoshi's Island when it launched. So I was playing a lot of video games by '95, but I wasn't aware of like a lot of stuff going on. So I wasn't aware of the Saturn or the PS1 or any of that. So my first exposure to 3D gaming was the N64. Since I had Nintendo Power and it was one of the only sources of news I had, I kind of knew about the N64. So when the N64 finally came out, I went to a store. I think maybe it was a Walmart, but I'm not sure. It might have been a Toys R Us or something else. But I went to a store and they had a demo kiosk again of Mario 64 this time. I remember there was like one other person. There were probably other people there, but I remember at least one other person playing the game before me, and I wanted to play the game because, I mean, it was 3D, and I never saw a 3D game before. This was literally the first time I ever saw a 3D game. Wrap your head around that one. So I was watching like the person in front of me play the game for a bit, and they were a lot older than I was. I don't remember if they were like a teenager or if they were an adult or what, but they were definitely older than I was, because I was still a kid. They were playing it, and they had a lot of trouble with the first boss. Basically, the demo was the first level of the game, which is Bob-omb Battlefield, and you climb up to the top of the mountain, and then at the top is the boss, which is basically a giant bomb dude, King Bomb, Bob-omb, or whatever. The way you're supposed to defeat this guy is that you're supposed to grab him from behind and then throw him onto the ground. But the person that was playing made which I guess is a common beginner's mistake. They made the mistake of thinking that you had to throw the boss off the mountain. And for some reason that doesn't hurt the boss. The boss, if you throw him off the mountain, he just jumps back onto the mountain and he goes like, "That's not how you hurt me, try again." So then this person just couldn't figure it out. They kept trying over and over and over, and they could not figure out how to harm the boss. They keep throwing the boss off the mountain, and the boss jumps back on, and that doesn't hurt the boss, so it was a stalemate. So after a while, the person gave up and left. I was frustrated, and then I got to play. So then I was like, well, I'm obviously going to do a lot better. Like, I know how to do this. So then I started playing, and unfortunately, I also couldn't figure it out. My first inclination was also to throw the dude off the mountain, the bomb dude, and obviously that didn't work. So I kept trying, over and over, and I figured, well, maybe I didn't throw him high enough. Maybe I have to throw him, maybe he needs to fall further down, or maybe I need to throw him at the right angle. And I kept trying, and nothing worked. And eventually, I also had to give up. There's another embarrassing story for you, the Super Mario World door story, and now the Mario 64 first boss story, where I couldn't beat the first boss. But anyways, I think either after playing the demo, like immediately after, or maybe like a few days later or a few weeks, I don't know exactly time frame, but eventually I bought an N64. And obviously my parents kind of spoiled me rotten, because they basically bought me everything, like every single game console, every single game I ever wanted. They bought it for me. I mean, I owned the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, even a 32X, a Sega CD, a Game Boy, a Game Gear. I eventually, after the N64, I got a Saturn and PS1. I think I got the Saturn and PS1 probably in like 97. I got the N64 in 96 when it launched. Like, one of the only things I didn't have was a Virtual Boy. And the only reason I didn't get it is because there were a lot of rumors that it damaged your vision. I remember seeing some kids at school, actually, when I was a kid. They had the Virtual Boy and they were playing it. But there were those rumors, and even I was a kid, I was kind of scared at the prospect of playing the Virtual Boy, because I was pretty logical as a child. I was like, well, if this thing's gonna damage my vision, then I don't want to play it, because I value my vision. I mean, if I can't see, how am I going to play video games? So even though I kind of wanted a Virtual Boy, I didn't ask my parents for it, because I'm sure if I pestered my parents for it, they would have eventually caved in and bought me one. But I didn't, because I was afraid of it, honestly. And I don't know if those rumors were really true or not, but that was the case. But anyways, going back to the N64, I had an N64, and I brought it home and I started playing it, and it was completely mind-blowing. To give you kind of like a reference, like I said, I never saw a 3D game before this point, and like there were moments as a kid where I would try to imagine what would it be like to play a 3D game, and I literally couldn't imagine it. I was like, I can't imagine how you could design a 3D game. I couldn't conceive of it. I just couldn't possibly fathom it. And then there it was right in front of me and I was playing it. And I used to think if games were 3D, that would basically be the final frontier. That would be like real life, like virtual reality. And obviously that's not the case, and one of the things that really fascinated me for some reason, I don't know why, was just being able to walk behind objects and see behind objects. Like, you'd see a sign and then you can just walk behind the sign and actually look at it, and you can turn the camera around. And like, there'd be a staircase and you can actually go behind the staircase and see the textures back there and turn the camera. So for some reason this fascinated me, like the idea that the developers and the designers would actually design stuff like that, like these little crevices and behind objects that nobody would ever think to go. I was just like, how can there be something back there? Why would the developers put something back there for you to see? Why would they let you go back there? And the fact that you could go back there and see stuff, even if there wasn't really much to see, it just blew my mind. Because in a 2D game, you can't do that. I mean, you can't see behind objects or under objects, whatever in a 2D game. If there's a sign in a 2D game, you can't see behind that sign. And basically, the back of that sign doesn't even exist. It's not rendered. It's not created. It's not even there. You just see the front and the back doesn't even exist. So the idea that something like an object, like a sign, could exist and every single side of it exists and can be viewed, that just completely blew my mind. That's probably hard to imagine for most people that grew up with 3D games. 3D is just common to you. It's just, there was never a point in your life, if you're a person that grew up with 3D games, that is, then there was maybe never a point in your life where you made that transition. But I made that transition and it was a pretty big deal. Now, there was kind of like a small minor issue that I ran into because I was not used to 3D games, I guess. When I first started playing Mario 64 at home, this didn't really happen at the demo because I didn't spend too much time on the demo. But when I brought the game home and started playing it, my eyes started to like hurt for some reason. So I got pretty concerned about this as a kid. I was like, oh no, does this mean I can't play Mario 64? Am I going to have to quit playing the game? Like, I was just completely terrified. I liked the game so much, but on the other hand, I was like, well, because as a kid, my mind just kind of jumped to conclusions. So one of the conclusions I was jumping to was like, maybe if I continue playing this game, I'm gonna go blind, and then I can't play games anymore. And I don't want that to happen. But this game is so good. I love it so much. I don't want to give it up. So I was really torn and conflicted, and this was like a huge dilemma for me. So then I told my mom about it, and then she was like, okay, well, we'll take you to the eye doctor and see what's going on. So I went to the eye doctor, and I told him my symptoms, and then he showed me like a 3D image, and he's like, how do you feel when you see this? And I was like, well, my eyes kind of hurt. And then basically the gist of it was that he was like, well, this is pretty normal. You've never seen 3D images before, your eyes are not accustomed to it, so it's giving you significant eye strain. So then I was like, okay, well, what do I do about it? And he's like, well, you're gonna have to play more Mario 64 because the only way this will stop is if your eyes get used to it, and the only way your eyes will get used to it is if you do it more often. And I was like, well, I can do that, and this was like a huge godsend for me. I was like, well, this is the best news ever. I mean, and I guess he was right, because eventually, after a while, the eye strain or the pain I had in my eyes, it went away. Like I could play Mario 64 for like 6 hours straight, and my eyes would feel fine. And obviously nowadays, 3D games don't bother my eyes anymore. But that's pretty crazy. Like I didn't even know that was a thing that can happen, and I'm not sure if that's something that happens to people now anymore, since everybody grows up playing 3D games nowadays. So that was, and I was pretty active during that console generation. I bought a lot of games. In the late 90s, I subscribed to Nintendo Power, so I started to get issues of Nintendo Power every month, and I was pretty up to date on most of the gaming news, at least as far as Nintendo was concerned. And sometimes I would buy magazines from other brands that would talk about the PS1 and Saturn. And I did eventually buy the PS1 and the Saturn. I didn't own very many Saturn games, but I got Knights with my Saturn, and that was like one of my favorite games of all time, and definitely one of my favorite Saturn games. And then, I got the PS1, and I got Final Fantasy, and I mostly played RPGs on the PS1. And it was around the late 90s where I started to get into RPGs in general. Like the very first RPG I played was Super Mario RPG, and I played that in 96 when it first came out. And that was the very first RPG I played, and it was kind of like a train wreck. I didn't even know what an RPG was at the time when I got that game. So at first I was kind of off-put by it. I was like, why are they taking turns to hit each other? Why do numbers pop out when you attack enemies? What's going on? But after a while I got the gist of it and I understood it. And then I really liked it. So then I got pretty hardcore into RPGs in the late 90s from then on. I went on, after Mario RPG, I went and I played Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 and all that stuff. That's most of my gaming history from the late 80s to early 90s to the late 90s. And then in 1999, I went to a demo. This one I know for sure was at Walmart. I remember this a bit better since it's more recent. I played a demo of Sonic Adventure, and I was completely blown away by these graphics because you have to remember, in 1999, the two most popular consoles were the N64 and the PS1, and the PS1 was more popular at this time. And the graphics of the PS1 and N64 were very primitive. I mean, they were honestly pretty bad. So then all of a sudden you had the Dreamcast. It just came out of nowhere, and it had absolutely, like, the graphics of the Dreamcast were light years ahead of the N64 and the PS1. Particularly in Sonic Adventure, which is one of the best looking Dreamcast games. So I remember playing Sonic Adventure in the demo at Walmart, and I was just dumbfounded. I was just like, is this real? Is this possible? And then obviously I got a Dreamcast shortly thereafter with Sonic Adventure. And while I didn't like Sonic Adventure as much as the Genesis Sonic games, I still thought it was alright, and I still enjoyed it. And it's one of my favorite 3D Sonic games. Although I admit it is pretty flawed, and it does have a lot of problems. And Big the Cat does certainly suck. And then from then on, the GameCube and PS2 came out. I'm gonna kind of like blast through the rest of this because I've gone on long enough already, and I think this has already covered my gaming history, and this basically covered also most of the consoles I owned. And I also already wrote an article about some of this information, so I'm kind of just repeating some of this information since nobody reads my articles. So around the time of the PS2 and GameCube, it was at that point where I started to feel alienated, and that's when the disappointment started to set in with video gaming. Because I was pretty happy with the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and the N64 and the PS1 and even the Saturn, which didn't do that well. And I was happy for most of the 90s as far as gaming was concerned. But then in the early 2000s with the PS2 and the GameCube, I got really disappointed with most of the games that got released. And I don't want to go too into why that is, but basically, a lot of the big sequels I was waiting for disappointed me, and I didn't like a lot of the games that were being released at the time. And the big thing is, I really like 2D side-scrolling platforming games. Why? Well, maybe, I don't know completely why. I guess there's just something about them I like. Maybe it's because I grew up with them. One of the first games I ever played was a side-scrolling platformer. And for most of my early childhood, I mostly played side-scrolling platformers. So maybe that's why I like them. I don't know, but that's basically my favorite type of game. And during the PS2 and GameCube days, there weren't very many of those games. Like pretty much the only games like that being released were on the GBA. And I felt like the GBA was kind of disappointing because the GBA is the Game Boy Advance, the handheld. I thought it was disappointing because they mostly had like really watered down, crappy Super Nintendo ports. And I already owned all the Super Nintendo games that were being ported to the GBA, and they didn't seem as good as the originals. You know, I was kind of frustrated. I never owned an original Xbox. That's one console I never owned. But I did have a GameCube and a PS2. And then later on, I got a Wii, PS3, and Xbox 360, and then a Wii U. And that kind of brings us to today. So ever since the PS2 and GameCube days, I kind of didn't. That's when I started to fall out with modern gaming, because you could say, I mean, nobody starts out obviously as an old school gamer or quote unquote retro gamer. I mean, back when the Super Nintendo was a modern game console, I was a modern gamer. But then when the Super Nintendo became a retro console, then I basically became a retro gamer. That's pretty much how that works. And so during the PS2 GameCube days, I got really nostalgic for the Super Nintendo, and I got really disappointed and frustrated that games like that weren't being released anymore. And it was around then that I created my website, I suppose out of my frustration. And I decided to dedicate my website to these old games from the 80s and the 90s. And I spent a lot of the early 2000s just kind of going back and playing the games of my childhood, and also playing games I missed out on because, obviously I didn't play every single Super Nintendo game that came out when I was a kid. I missed out on a lot of games. So I kind of spent the early 2000s going back and playing almost every Super Nintendo game I missed out on that I wanted to play or maybe didn't even know about at the time. And I had a lot of fun. And that's basically where I became a retro gamer. And I think every era has like a game that there's a lot of. Like right now, the most popular game is first-person shooters, or like third-person shooters, or open-world games. These are the most popular games. But these games don't really appeal to me. I'm not really into those kinds of those styles of games. And I guess I suppose that's why that answers Master V's question as why I gravitate more towards retro games or old school games, is because it's different styles. The styles that are popular right now just don't appeal to me. I'm not into them. I have to turn to retro games or old school games. That's basically what it comes down to. So I hope this satisfied your curiosity. It's about time I wrap this up because this is pretty long. This is going to be an hour and a half. This is the end of episode 3 of Tavern Talk. Now remember, if you have another topic you'd like to suggest, you can do so in the comments. And that is the end of that. Well, later everyone.